everyone. It's great to see you all. Welcome to our third and last Critical Chinese Humanities series lectures of this fall semester. My name is Polu. I teach the modern Chinese literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and also the coordinator of the Critical Chinese Humanities lecture series. And thank you also very much for coming and joining us today. Before we start, I wanted to thank our co-sponsors, the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, and the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. I would also like to thank Peter Chen, our graduate assistant, for coordinating all the logistics. And today is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, our guest today, Professor Emily Wilcox. Professor Wilcox is Marjorie Hamilton Professor of Modern Languages, Literatures, and Chinese Studies at William & Mary. She's also the 2024 Guggenheim Fellow in Dance Studies. Professor Wilcox received her PhD from University of California in Berkeley, and her research focuses on 20th and 21st century Chinese dance and performance studies, engaging critically and broadly with various disciplines and fields of studies, such as Chinese gender ethnic minority studies, the Sinophone and Chinese diaspora studies, inter-Asian cultural studies, and also, of course, the political, cultural, and diplomatic history of modern China. She has published numerous articles and authored and co-edited 6 books on the topic, covering the topics of dance, bodies, media, and performing arts in the context of not only China proper, but also the larger East Asian and Asian regions. Her monograph, Revolutionary Bodies, Chinese Dance and the Socialist Legacy, is a award-winning book and was received the 2019 De La Torre Bueno Prize from the Dance Studies Association. Her edited volumes includes Corporeal Politics, Dancing East Asia, Inter-Asia Emotion, Dance as Method, and Teaching Film from the People's Republic of China. Professor Wilcox's new research really extends broader into the global context and really situates the studies of dance and performing arts in a transnational and global context. And the book, the current book project she's working on, titled Performing Solidarities, Dancing the World in Mao's China. And then today we're very fortunate to invite her to give us a preview or some part of this book, and then to share her recent findings on the international dance exchanges and the South-South solidarity in China during the Cold War era. So we really look forward to listening to the talk and learning from her insights. And then for today's event, Professor Wilcox will use about 40 to 45 minutes to present her research. And then my colleague, Professor Tian Ying, from the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, will have a conversation with Professor Wilcox and for 15 minutes to elaborate more on some of the themes, topics, or methods in this research. And then we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Wilcox.
Thank you so much, Lou, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Ying, for coming to be a discussion, and thank you, Lydia, for having the idea for this talk to begin with. And thank you all for coming. So today I will be focusing on one case study from the new project. So you can see from the new subtitle, it's more specifically about this tour from Mexico. So I'll be focusing on that, but I think that this case study will allow us to talk about some of the broader questions and concerns of the project as a whole. So in the summer and fall of 1957, China received the first 2 of 21 performing arts groups from Latin America that would tour China between 1949 and 1976. The 2 groups were from Mexico, a country that did not formally recognize the PRC until 1972, but nevertheless had a vibrant culture of leftism in society. So this made Mexico an ideal partner for China's Cold War international relations strategy that was known as people's diplomacy, or 人民外交, which was targeted at engagements with sympathetic individuals or groups rather than government-to-government direct interaction. So the first Mexican delegation included 5 people. 2 dancers and 3 musicians, and stayed from July 8th until late July, visiting 2 cities, Beijing and Shanghai. The second troupe included 38 members, mainly dancers, and remained in China from August 26th until mid-October, visiting 5 cities, Beijing, Tianjin, Nanjing, Shanghai, and Hangzhou. So as indicated on 2 extant performance programs, which are housed in the University of Michigan Chinese Dance Collection, both groups were hosted by the Chinese People's Association for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries. And reports on the group's performances appeared in numerous Chinese newspapers and periodicals during their tours, including People's Daily, Guangming Daily, Workers' Daily, People's Music, China Youth Daily, Xinhua Daily, Liberation Daily, Wenhui Daily, Zhejiang Daily, Hangzhou Daily, etc. So from all of these reports, we know that these groups performed in major venues, such as Beijing's People's Theater and Tianqiao Theater, Nanjing's Great Hall of the People, Shanghai's People's Grand Theater, and Hangzhou's Great Hall of the People, as well as the Beijing Workers' Club, and often performing for audiences in the thousands. In each location, the performers were greeted by national and local leaders, as well as major figures in the arts world. So Premier Zhou Enlai and Premier Huolong even went on stage and took photos with the second group during their performance on September 4th at Tianqiao Theater. So in other words, thank you, Lydia. In other words, these tours were treated by the Chinese media and national and local governments as major cultural and diplomatic events. For China's dance field, they presented a precious opportunity to make international connections and to directly witness dance creations from other parts of the world. So one thing that immediately interested me when I began to read the Chinese media reports about these 2 Mexican tours was the language that was being used to describe the groups. So specifically, Chinese reporting on both of the Mexican tours consistently featured new formulations involving the Chinese word ballet, or ballet, which refers to a European classical dance form that originated in 15th century Italian courts and then went on to become an internationally popular dance form in the 20th century. So the program for the first group featured the phrase folk ballet dance artist, 民间芭蕾舞蹈家. And the program for the second tour used the name National Modern Ballet Dance Ensemble, so 民族现代芭蕾舞. So in both cases, these formulations were repeated consistently throughout the Chinese reporting. However, both folk ballet, 民间芭蕾, and national modern ballet, 民族现代 ballet, were neologisms in Chinese at this time. So neither the People's Daily nor Guangming Daily, according to their database search, searching in the database, they had never used these phrases prior to the arrival of these 2 Mexican ensembles. And within the Chinese dance discourse of the time, the terms folk, 民间, meaning rural or popular, and national or ethnic, 民族, meaning local or Chinese in the context of Chinese dance discourse, and then modern, 现代, meaning of the contemporary era, were typically conceptualized in China at this time as antithetical to ballet for different reasons. And so ballet, again, was a form associated with a universalized European classical elite culture that was rooted in the past. So the dance works the Mexican dance groups performed in China also did not conform to the stylistic conventions of classical ballet. Nor did they include any works of the classical ballet repertoire. So this would have been evident to China's professional dancers at the time, many of whom had learned ballet from Russians who had fled to China from the Soviet Union before 1949, and from Chinese diaspora, Korean, Soviet, and other dancers who had taught ballet in China in the 1940s and 50s. So ballet was a known entity, and the Mexican dance tours brought dance that did not correspond to what was conventionally thought of as ballet. Moreover, discussions of ballet, so the conceptual understanding of ballet, was widely discussed in China's professional dance publications during the 1950s, when ballet was often a subject of intense controversy and debate. So this is something I wrote about in Revolutionary Bodies. So the concept of ballet and the need for precise distinction between ballet and other dance styles, especially folk, national, and modern dance was seen as something quite important in Chinese dance discourse. And in fact, 1957, the year that these two groups came, was an important year because it was when the Beijing Dance School actually separated its students into two separate tracks, one for ballet and one for local Chinese dance forms, to better maintain what was perceived as a necessary separation between these two dance styles. It was also the same year that modern dance was briefly considered for inclusion in the curriculum, but then ultimately rejected. So given this context, why was the term ballet used in the Chinese writing about the Mexican tours? Moreover, why was ballet combined with folk, national, and modern to create this new dance terminology that had not been employed previously in China? And how did this terminology generate new meanings and shape the reception of the Mexican dance programs in China? So the new language most likely came from direct translation of the names of the dance companies that were involved in these two tours. So Josefina Lavalle and Guillermina Bravo, from the first and the second groups respectively, were both foundational figures in the Ballet Nacional de Mexico. So this was an independent group established in 1948 that, in the words of Mexican dance historian Alberto Dalal, emphasized, quote, progressive political and artistic attitudes. So the extant program for the first Mexican tour that came to China actually suggests that this term folk ballet was the initial Chinese translation of Ballet Nacional. So a brief description that introduces the performers on the last page of the program that you can see here introduces the Mexico Folk Ballet Dance Company as being founded in 1948 by these two famous dancers, Josefina Lavalle and Bravo. So it's clearly pointing to that particular truth. So it makes it clear that Mexican Folk Ballet Dance Company was the Chinese translation for Ballet Nacional de Mexico. 9 dancers are listed in the program for this first tour, representing, quote, folk ballet, performed by Lavalle and Puente. So in the program, we can see that they brought a series of dances that are listed here, most of which are derived from different popular and folk forms from Mexico. And there is a description of several of the works that were performed at the Beijing Workers' Club that you can see here. So it describes the mariachi dance as being choreographed according to an Indian, so indigenous wedding, and preserving the special nature of and character of Mexican Indians. This is the language used. This other piece, Mexican Toy, fully expressed the people's mood of enthusiasm for peace and happiness. In the dance Tribute to Heroes, the two artists present succinct dance movements filled with sculptural beauty, expressing the land struggle carried out beginning in 1917, led by the peasant leader Zapata. And it says that they also perform works filled with Spanish styles such as bamba dance, Yucatan hailing dance, as well as the dance most representative of Mexican folk art, the jarabe dance. Just as an aside, of course, all of these dances are being transliterated into Chinese, so I had to do the research to back translate, but I was able to figure out what most of them were. So at this time, folk dance had both stylistic and political associations in China. So folk dance was linked to popular performance, but it was also linked to leftist politics. This is something I've explored in other writings. So the choice to translate the Ballet Nacional as folk ballet could reflect these two important meanings. So the specific content of the program's tour, which consisted of choreographies adapted from Mexican popular culture, as well as a dance celebrating a peasant revolutionary, right? The dance about Zapata. And also, it could reflect the political mission of the ensemble. So according to that program description that I showed earlier, quote, they often go to mines, the countryside, and construction sites to perform for the broad masses. This was a description of the Ballet Nacional. So in this context, the neologism folk ballet was a way to preserve the original name of the company while also communicating to Chinese audiences what types of dance the performers were presenting. So in the case of the second tour, the new term National Modern Ballet reflects both this distinct institutional composition of the second tour, which I'll get to in a moment, as well as the different performance program that this second tour brought. So K. Mitchell Snow, in his book, A Revolution in Movement, has offered some context for the second tour. So he explains that it actually combined dancers from two different companies, One was the Ballet Nacional, the same one I just was talking about, headed by Bravo. And then the second one was the Ballet Contemporáneo, which on this tour, the group was led by Elena Noriega. So the relationship between these two companies was complicated and embodied longstanding conflicts in the Mexican dance field at that time. So as described by Snow, the Ballet Contemporáneo, the second one, actually arose within the National Institute of Fine Arts in Mexico, while the Ballet Nacional was formed by Bravo and others when they left the academy because they had artistic and political disagreements. So that's what I just explained. And so Snow gives us further context to say that both Guillermina Bravo's independent Ballet Nacional and the Ballet Contemporáneo received invitations to perform in Moscow through the Mexican Communist Party. The dancers knew they had no hopes of securing support from INBA, so that was the National Arts Institute, given the anti-communist stance of the President Adolfo Ruiz Cortines' administration. And the process of working together to present their works in Moscow and elsewhere in Europe and Asia, so this is the same tour where they came to China, it led these dancers, what he calls the battling cliques of dancers to finally unite, right, to come together on this tour. So according to Mexican dance scholar Raimundo Ruiz Gonzalez, who I think is on the Zoom call, this group also went under like several different names on their international tour. And so one of these names actually merged the titles of the two groups, as we can see here, Ballet Nacional Contemporáneo de Mexico. So Alberto Dalal, the Mexican historian I mentioned earlier, also confirmed that this was the term that was used during the 1957 tour in one of his writings. So it seems to be this combined name that actually served as the source for the Chinese neologism, National Modern Ballet. So a total of 16 dances appeared in the program for this second larger group, and you can see them listed here. Of these, 4 were by the Ballet Nacional. These were, so this is the total items listed in the performance program. The ones in green are the ones that I was able to find descriptions of in the Chinese newspaper. So those are the ones that I believe were actually performed. And then within those 8, half were by the Ballet Nacional and half were by the Ballet Contemporáneo. So it was a fusion of the repertoires of these two groups. So the joining of the 3 seemingly contradictory terms in this Chinese neologism, National Modern Ballet, reflected the diversity of this program, which I'll talk more about in a moment, as well as these tensions, these interpersonal, political, and aesthetic tensions underlying the composition of the program. So in terms of its choreographic styles and themes, different interpretations of the national and the modern, and competing lineages of dancers. To use the term ballet in the names of these companies still requires further explanation, however, since, as I've already mentioned, none of these works performed by either of the two groups exhibited traditional conventions of European classical ballet. So when the second group performed in Shanghai, a reviewer actually remarked that the performance, quote, caused Shanghai's ballettimains to expand their artistic horizon. So Shanghai was the place where there were, the most knowledge of ballet at this time. And I think this was a subtle way of saying people were pretty surprised by what they saw. Yet, since ballet appeared in the Mexican ensemble names themselves, the original names in Spanish, we need to understand why dancers in Mexico would have used the term ballet themselves in naming their own companies. So to explain this choice, Dalal writes, when the Ballet Nacional de Mexico was founded as an autonomous entity in 1948, its members considered the forms of classical ballet invalid, and they therefore rejected the technical preparation required by the genre. Their decision to use the term ballet in the name of the new organization demonstrated their desire to appropriate and socialize elements from this elite art form, these elite art forms that were until this point remote from the lay performer and the general public. So in Mexico, as well as other places around the world, including China, ballet is deeply intertwined with histories of European colonization and racialized aesthetic hierarchies that are grounded in constructions of whiteness. So this has been extensively theorized in the dance historiography. So the Mexican dancers who visited China in 1957 were trained in this broader context, and they were actually trained by an international cohort of artists. And so in discussing this international cohort of artists who trained the dancers who came on the tour, Jose Luis Reynoso, in his new award-winning book, Dancing Mestizo Modernisms, explains that this earlier generation, quote, employed ballet and modern dance training regimes and choreographic conventions associated primarily with Europe and the United States to, quote, modernize Mexican, quote, traditional dances and develop a form of dance that was distinctively Mexican and universal in reach, unquote. So Reynoso theorizes this practice, which he attributes to a series of dancers, including Nelly and Gloria Campobello, Ana Sokolow, and Waldine Falkenstein, all of whom were key teachers of Lavai, Bravo, and Noriega, as promoting what he called embodied mestizo modernisms. And so what is significant about this concept here is that while the earlier cohort of dancers that he's talking about grounded their work in ballet and modern dance, they rejected the simple reproduction of ballet and modern dance practices in their choreography. Rather, Reynoso writes, they, quote, adapted these practices to create dances that converse with the specificities of local histories, unquote, right? That's why he calls them mestizo modernisms. So an illustration of this concept can be seen in how one of these early teachers, the pair of sisters named Nelly and Gloria Campobello, in their 1930 interpretation of a very important Mexican folk dance, El Jarabe Tapatío, differed from the interpretation of the same dance by the Russian ballet dancer Anna Pavlova a decade prior to them. So in his book, Choreographing Mexico, also an award-winning recent monograph, Manuel Cuellar explains, quote, when the Campobellos performed it, it exemplified the use of local, regional, and traditional dances as a means of interpreting Mexican national identity. In fact, the Campobellos' performance gained much of its significance from its perceived contrast to Pavlova's balleticized interpretation, because the sisters were seen as, quote, reclaiming the El Jarabe Tapatío for Mexican dancers while maintaining a high level of artistic quality, unquote. So this practice of reclaiming rested on a rejection of obvious aspects of ballet technique, in this case, ballet's distinctive point shoe. So Cuellar writes, the Campobello sisters did not dance in traditional ballet shoes, but rather in Mexican huaraches, confirming the dance's status as a national symbol. Pavlova, on the other hand, famously performed this dance on point. And so in Reynoso's analysis of the same production, he explains that the Campobello sisters and Pavlova were creating Mexican modernisms, but he argues that they were doing so in different ways. So both of these were mestizo modernisms, but different approaches to mestizo modernisms. And then also Sokolow and Waldine, who I'll talk about later, also continued to experiment with different forms of mestizo modernism. So he says that these embodied mestizo modernisms changed over time, showing a general shift further and further and further from ballet. So the dancers who visited China in 1957 belong to the generation that Snow calls the golden age, but this is another image of Pavlova performing the same dance in point shoes. So Snow refers to the generation of dancers who were trained by the people I was just talking about, the ones who came on this tour in 1957 to China as the, quote, golden age of Mexican modern dance. So most of the dancers on the tour had previously worked with modern dancers from the United States, in addition to the dancers that I just mentioned. So this included someone who goes by the name Waldine, so Waldine Falkenstein, as well as Ana Sokolow, who actually established their own competing groups of Mexican modern dancers in the 1940s, as well as Jose Limon, who was a Mexican-American choreographer who created work on Mexican dancers in the early 1950s. So of the key dancers and choreographers whose work was featured on this tour, Bravo and Lavai were both disciples of Waldine. Rosa Reina, Elena Noriega, Valentina Castro, Riccio Sogan, and Rogelio Ortega all had danced with Sokolow, and Valentina Castro, Riccio Sogan, Beatriz Flores had danced in Limon's 1951 premiere of Tonantzintla in Mexico City, which is actually one of the works included on the tour. And then there's other connections. So Reina developed her work, The Vow, which was one of the works produced on the tour, presented on the tour in China under Limon's mentorship. And then Fernacio de Bernal whose work The Roosters was featured on the tour, was actually created through influence from Limon. So these two American modern dancers, Ana Sokolow and Limon, both played an important role in mentoring these dancers, in addition to Waldy. So these dancers went on then to develop their own repertoire of Mexican modern dance, much of which was actually on display during their 1957 tours. So the significance of these dancers and the works that they toured in China in the history of Mexican modern dance is undisputed. So for example, the Oxford Dictionary of Dance describes Bravo as, quote, widely regarded as the most important figure in Mexican modern dance. Mexican dance historian Margarita Tortajada Quiroz described Lavai, who led the first tour, as, quote, a dancer, teacher, researcher, and choreographer, and the director of the first generation of Mexican nationalist modern dance, who choreographed one of the most important early Mexican modern dance pieces, Juan Calavera, which was also presented on the tour. And she goes on to describe Reina as, quote, a dancer, choreographer, and teacher in the first Mexican nationalist modern dance movement, who choreographed one of the early works, one of the important early works, The Vow or La Manda, which was also featured on the tour. And then she mentions that Sagan was, quote, one of the best known dancers in the nationalist tendency of Mexican modern dance. And then similarly, Tortajada Quiroz called Di Bernal, quote, a dancer in the Mexican modern dance tradition, choreographer of Los Gallos, the Roosters, which was one of the most important early Mexican modern dancers. So we can tell from this that this group was very carefully selected and represented the most important not only works, but also dancers and choreographers in the golden age of Mexican modern dance. So in Mexico, as in other parts of the world, including China, the development of modern dance actually also came with a critical relationship to ballet. So when Bravo co-founded her first dance company in 1946, with Ana Merida, a follower of Sokolow, the program of their opening performance described their company, established in 1946, as follows, quote, experimental, its objectives to abandon both the technique and ideology of classical ballet. So they make this very straightforward. They're abandoning ballet ideologically and technically, to take fundamental indigenous and mestizo elements to create an art lifted from the heart and struggles of the people, to convert it into a direct and profound medium of expression that offers the people orientation, stimulus, and culture. This is all in their original performance program statement. To elevate the dance by giving it a worthy professional character, which places Mexico at the same level of other countries in this expression of art, striving even to outdo them. So that was their manifesto in 1946. So how is this conveyed to Chinese audiences? So interestingly, there was actually an article that was written, quote unquote, for Chinese audiences by one of the members of the Mexican group, translated into Chinese and then published in the Workers' Daily to sort of educate Chinese audiences about what they would be seeing. And so in this essay, Carballido, the author of the essay, explains that in 1940, a new type of art form appeared in Mexico, Mexican dance. This kind of dance was initiated by a group of dance artists because they couldn't find a form in European ballet to express the spirit and concerns of their nation. These dance artists do not use ballet as point shoes, and their bodily movements are not restricted by the principles of ballet point technique. They decided to follow a new kind of new artistic trend with a different character: full body free movement and barefoot directly in contact with the floor. In this kind of new dance, they use the rich resources of their own country's folk dances, and the content they perform reflected the Mexican people's thoughts, feelings, and activities. So the year 1940 is important because it's frequently cited in histories of Mexican dance as the starting point of, quote, Mexican modern dance, the Mexican modern dance movement. And so this is, for example, when Sokolow and Waldine, in the words of Jose Luis Reynoso, quote, led the first two modern dance companies in the country, and a new form of Mexican modern dance emerged, unquote. So here are Carballido's description of this new form of dance as one that rejects the balletic point shoe and uses bare feet, engaging in, quote, full body free movement and direct contact with the floor, clearly aligns with the practices of European and US modern dance, and is also reflected in the photographs from the tour. However, by calling this new movement Mexican dance rather than Mexican modern dance, Carballido signals Reynoso's argument about mestizo modernism. that these dancers were not engaged in a wholesale reproduction of any existing international dance practice, including Euro-American modern dance or ballet, and rather were creating a new dance practice that was specific to Mexico. So Carballido goes on to then describe a national dance school, the Mexican Dance Academy, where he says students are learning a combination of this, what he calls barefoot ballet, and, quote, the folk dances of the whole country. And the school he refers to is the Academia de la Danza Mexicana, which was established in 1947 under the co-direction of Bravo and Merida at the newly established school, the Institute for Fine Arts, which was led by Carlos Chavez. So then Carballido goes on to then introduce the two dance ensembles established by the teachers from the school, the modern ballet ensemble established by Noriega, the Ballet Contemporanea, and the National Ballet, or the Ballet Nacional, which was established by Bravo. And Bravo, he explains, is, quote, one of the founders of this new art. So he really educates the Chinese audience and critics about who these people are and what they're seeing. And so interestingly, his article actually had a strong impact on the reception of Mexican dancers in China. So I kept seeing the Chinese critics like cite the article, they didn't use quotation marks, they were using language from the article to describe what they were seeing and borrowing his language. So the respected choreographer and dancer Jia Zuoguang, for example, when he introduces the concept of modern ballet in his review, provides the following description. So it's a kind of dance form that uses free movement of the whole body with bare feet and direct contact with the floor. In the dances of this kind of modern dance, they use the rich resources of their country's folk dances, and the content they performed reflected the thought and feeling and life of the Mexican people. So you can see a lot of the language that Carballido presents being reused in Jia's review. So in all of the reviews I have found about the two Mexican tours, Jazz is actually the only one that uses the term modern dance, 现代舞. And because of the political baggage that this term carried in China at the time, because it was a banned Western dance form that was associated with bourgeois capitalist culture from the United States, this could also be a reason why terms such as folk ballet and national modern ballet, or even modern ballet, were preferred over the term modern dance in these Chinese reviews of what the Mexican dancers were bringing. And furthermore, because these terms were newly created, I think that they actually allowed audiences in China to dispel any preconceived notions or categorizations or genres about what they could expect from the Mexican dancers. So audiences and readers who were experienced with modern dance, which actually included Jia himself, who began his dance training with Ishibaku, the quote-unquote father of Japanese modern dance, they would have recognized elements of modern dance in the dancers' bare feet, for example, and other aesthetic elements. However, by avoiding the explicit terminology of modern dance, the audiences and critics had more space to experience the dance performances outside of an anti-modern dance ideological framework. And at the same time, the use of these neologisms like folk ballet and national modern ballet also acknowledged the fact that the Mexican dancers were developing their own kind of dance that didn't fit any previously existing category. So it also allowed the Mexican modern dance to be its own entity, affirming the embodied project of mestizo modernism through this particular use of the Chinese linguistic context. So the Mexican dancers who came to China in 1957 were actually ideal partners for people's diplomacy, as I mentioned earlier, because they themselves held leftist political views and participated in dance activities in the broader socialist world. So the Ballet Nacional, established by Bravo and Levi in 1948, was, as I mentioned, a product of these political and aesthetic disputes within Mexico's own dance field. And these mapped roughly onto Cold War lines. So the origins of the disputes trace back to the two modern dance companies that had been founded in 1940 by Waldine and Sokolow, which developed into what Reynoso calls two aesthetically antagonistic factions within Mexico's modern dance world. So representatives of both groups initially worked together at the Academy of Mexican Dance, with Ana Merida representing Sokolow's followers and Bravo, the choreographer of the piece here, representing Waldine's followers. So in her book, so we have these two groups, the Sokolow followers and the Waldine followers. They were called Sokolovas and Waldinas. So in her important book about Ana Sokolow, Hannah Kostrin explains that Sokolow herself came from a revolutionary leftist tradition of Jewish communist modern dance in the United States. And Sokolow continued to develop this tradition during her work in Mexico in the 1940s, after it was no longer possible to do this in the United States because of the suppression of leftist art, right? And this continues during the Cold War. So Kostrin argues that Sokolow's transnational presence actually created what Kostrin calls a, quote, revolutionary spectatorship among audiences who shared proletarian sympathies across the international left, because Sokolow worked in Mexico and she also worked in Israel. Yet, Kostrin also shows that within the Mexican context, Sokolow's followers eventually actually became more aligned with the US Cold War trends of dance aesthetics, specifically the aesthetic of abstract modernism that became synonymous with anti-communism during the Cold War. So interestingly, it was actually the followers of Waldine, the other American modern dancer who established this competing group of dancers, of which Bravo and Levi were both part, who actually danced, who maintained an approach that was more consistent with leftist revolutionary modernism. And an interesting aside is that Waldine, the person who led this other group, had actually been a dancer in the company of the Japanese modern dancer Ito Michio. So her trajectory is also quite fascinating. We don't have time to go into it here. So explaining the differences between these two groups, Reynoso writes, quote, Merida, this is the Sokolow disciple, her preferences for abstraction contrasted with Bravo's interest in socially conscious and thus more accessible dance practice. As the world transitioned from World War II to the Cold War, abstraction gained more momentum as an aesthetic practice and ideological discourse in Western countries. And in that context, as a Waldina, Bravo's interest in a socially conscious dance form that represented an aesthetic and ideological other to this abstraction orientation. And so there were even accusations of Bravo running a communist cell within the Academy of Mexican Dance. And as a result, Merida created her different group, the Grupo Experimental, which was not involved in the tour, in 1949. And then Bravo departed and formed her Ballet Nacional. So the Mexican dance historian Tortajada Quiroz describes this rift in similar terms. She writes, Waldine's followers, headed by Bravos, supported socially and politically committed dance, whereas Sokolow's supporter Merida favored a more formalist approach. And so this occurred, Tortajada Quiroz explains, in the political context of the presidency of Mexico at the time, Miguel Alemán Valdez, who employed, quote, the rhetoric of modernization and the then popular rhetoric of anti-communism. So that was the political context in Mexico. So Bravo's own account, as quoted by Snow, also concurs with these explanations. So Bravo stated, ideology separated us. She told dance historian Cesar Delgado, indeed, I did and do have political ideas. Merida denounced me as a communist before Carlos Chavez, and I had to leave the academy. And so Tortajada Quiroz writes, quote, Bravo resigned, and in 1948, she and a majority of members of the Academy of Mexican Dance founded the Ballet Nacional de Mexico. So among these members was Josefina Levi, who led the first group, who was also a disciple of Waldine. So we can see that the group that came to China was the Waldina kind of lineage here. But as I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of Sokolovas who were also involved in the tour. So Bravo's approach, sorry, this is what I just read. So Bravo's approach to leftist, socially conscious choreography included a critical view of the United States as well. That was part of the content here that was being performed. So an important theme, this was actually an important theme, as we know, in international socialist dance at this time, right? Critiques of American imperialism, critiques of racism in the United States, et cetera. And so this was also popular in China at the time. And this theme was actually reflected in the work depicted here. Bravo's work, Culi, or Braceros is the original Spanish name of this piece. This was actually prominently featured in the 1957 tour in China. It was one of the most written about pieces in the tour by Chinese critics. And describing this piece, Snow writes, Braceros, which was premiered in 1956, was a love story set against the economic conditions that produced continuous waves of migrant farm workers to the United States and their unhappy conditions there. So in his review, Jia Zuoguang wrote of this piece, which the name was translated into Culi. in Chinese. Quote, "The contradiction presented in the plot of the performance tells the audience how the Mexican peasants are humiliated and oppressed by the American soldiers. What the US gives them is not well-being, is not being well-dressed and well-fed, but a life of hunger and the total absence of justice, at every moment struggling on the brink of death. The dancers' moving performances stirred up the deep sympathy of the audience," Zhao writes. And another review of this piece, when it was performed in Nanjing, stated that the tragic portrayal of Mexican migrant laborers in the United States, quote, "caused people's hearts to break." So in 1949, Bravo had actually proposed to restage an important work called Horsepower, or HP, which was a failed ballet about Pan-Americanism that was co-produced by Carlos Chavez and Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican muralist, that was originally staged in Philadelphia in 1932. And Bravo's new version had a decidedly anti-US twist. So describing this production, Ellie Guerrero writes, "In Bravo's revised plot scheme, the Mexican people and the revolution liberate Horsepower, HP, who has been chained by an enormous Judas figure who is swallowing Mexico's raw materials with a huge devouring mouth. Bravo's version of the North as a vampire preying on the mineral veins of Latin America was not well received." Right? So this gives us a sense of the other types of work that Bravo was creating. So in 1953, getting back to this theme that these dancers were involved in the socialist world more broadly, it's interesting to note that in 1953, 4 of the dancers from this leftist group in Mexico had actually premiered what became one of the defining works of Mexican modern dance, actually at one of these socialist dance festivals, the 4th World Festival of Youth and Students in Bucharest, Romania. And the image on the left here is an image of that piece called Zapata. So in 2017, when I visited the archive of the World Festivals of Youth and Students in Amsterdam, I was flipping through all the festival magazines, looking at all the images of dancers. And I remember when I came across this image, it was quite striking because it was different from a lot of the other dances being presented in these festivals at the time. And it was very clearly a work of modern dance with very clear political themes. So I was surprised to see it included in these socialist dance festivals, which tended not to include modern dance for reasons I explained earlier. So these socialist dance festivals were often criticized in the West as, quote, communist propaganda events, but actually they were a very important site and platform for international dance festivals and competitions in the socialist world, as well as in the global South during the 1950s and 60s. And Chinese dance ensembles also participated in all of these from 1949 to 1962. So Chinese dancers were performing in the same space as these Mexican dancers during this time. And so Snow, writing about this, actually says that, for example, the Mexican dancers, when they premiered this piece in Bucharest at the National Stadium, were immediately followed by the state academic folk dance, the Moseyev ensemble from the Soviet Union. So they were part of this larger circulation of socialist dance. So interestingly, this group in 1953, when they were on their way back from the festival, the Mexican dancers traveled through Cuba, where they were thrown in a military jail and had their passports seized by the Batista government, quote, because they arrived in Cuba from a socialist country. And so one of the members of that earlier delegation from 1953, Sagan, actually joined the 1957 group that again went to the World Festival of Youth and Students in Moscow in 1957 and then toured China. So as mentioned in the program and reporting from the smaller 1957 tour to China, the Ballet Nacional de Mexico demonstrated a commitment to leftist politics, not only in the content and aesthetics of their productions, but also in their performance sites and audiences. So the program states, quote, they often go to mines, the countryside, and construction sites, as I mentioned earlier, to perform for the broad masses. And so according to Snow, part of the reason for this approach was actually financial, because Bravo's group members, this is a quote from Snow, lacked most of the resources that their former counterparts, right, in the nationally funded organizations enjoyed. So Bravo's company rehearsed wherever it could find space, mostly under the sponsorship of government agencies other than the international or the fine arts school. The Ballet Nacional typically performed in ad hoc venues in rural communities, where, as Bravo later phrased it, quote, Spanish wasn't spoken and the company arrived by mule. So rather than seeing herself as a separate class from these rural communities they were performing for, Bravo actually herself identified with these communities. And so Snow writes that Bravo later told one of the Mexican critics that she disliked being characterized as having decided to, quote, do dance for the people. She said, "We are the people from among the people who dance." So the Ballet Nacional's political commitment was presented in other works they brought to China in 1957. Bravo's 1956 piece, Traitor, for example, El Demagogo, which was another piece presented on the 1957 tour, quote, told the story of a work stoppage brought to an unsuccessful end by the business owners buying off of its demagogic leader. So a failed strike, basically, and critiquing someone who had been a turncoat in the strike. Levi's Juan Calavaro, also from 1956, blended comedy and rural themes. It employed the animated skeletons popularized through the works of Jose Guadalupe Posada. In this case, an angel, a demon, and a pair of lovers, and the town drunk who engaged in a satire of village life. Several of the other works by Bravo that are listed in the program but are not discussed in the reviews also center issues of rural people and workers. So according to the program notes, one of the pieces called An Unfortunate Encounter of a Bricklayer took its theme from a news story that was reported on June 15th, 1957, about a Mexican bricklayer who suffered from depression because he was unemployed for 3 years and finally committed suicide by leaping from a scaffold. Snow calls Bravo's 1953 work, The Sterile Cloud, quote, her work based on Mexico's indigenous roots, based on her visit to the Otomi people in the Mezquital Valley of the state of Hidalgo, which lacked a secure supply of water. It centered around the death of a child who was buried in with a ceremonial broom so her spirit could sweep the clouds and produce rain, unfortunately to no effect. The last work by Bravo that's listed in the program is called Mark of the Revolution. The program notes state, quote, this dance portrays the lives of the oppressed classes, peasants, miners, workers, and penal laborers in Mexico during the authoritarian period of Porfirio Diaz. The dance shows how some people were forcibly captured and sent to the man-eating forests of the South to labor. Finally, it portrays their rebellion against the authoritarian tyrant, unquote. So that was the works brought by Bravo and her other collaborators in the Ballet Nacional. Now, the works brought by the Ballet Contemporáneo, led by Elena Noriega, was slightly different. So this program was less explicitly political, dealing with the themes I just described. So most notably, Tonantzintla, the piece pictured here, was actually the most successful piece that Jose Limon, the Mexican-American choreographer I mentioned earlier, had created and premiered while he was working in Mexico in 1951. At the invitation of Miguel Covarrubias, who was then serving as director of the National Fine Arts Center in Mexico. So Reynoso explains that the original title, Tonantzintla, is actually, it comes from a Nahuatl word, which is an indigenous language, meaning place of our beloved mother or goddess, and is actually based on the name of a small town in the state of Puebla near Mexico City, and the location of a colonial era church whose architectural decorations inspired Limon's piece. So the original costumes and sets were designed by Covarrubias, but Sagan recalls that for the China tour, a new set was created by Chinese artists using their own designs with clouds, stars, pyramids of the sun and moon, and Popocatépetl and Ixtaczoatl. The two works by Noriega, though not Baroque, had a similar sense of fantasy and indigeneity about them. So her 1951 piece, Earth, which was on the tour, took the duality of the earth in pre-Columbian Mexico, which could bring life through the growth of corn or death through drought as its theme. And the 1954 Three Mexican Toys featured a melodramatic love triangle that led to love between a mermaid doll and a toy bull. And then de Bernal's 1956 piece, The Roosters, was a piece that used cockfighting as a metaphor for the Mexican cult of machismo, rendered visible in the conflict over a hen. So one of the ballet contemporaneous pieces listed in the program, but apparently not performed, was Rosa Reina's 1951 work, The Vow La Manda, a very important piece in the history of Mexican modern dance. And this work was based on a short story by an author named Juan Rulfo about the pilgrimage of a sick woman accompanied by her husband and her friend to a hilltop sanctuary known for its miraculous cures. The woman died in agony before reaching the sanctuary, while her husband engaged himself in seducing her friend. So it appears that that piece was not performed. So although the Ballet Nacional was known for its socially conscious work, both groups were most likely left-leaning, right? They had a wide range of approaches to this. And Snow explains that Covarrubias, who had actually at one point hired an African-American dancer from New York's left-wing New Dance Group to teach at the Fine Arts Institute around 1950, Snow writes, quote, while this African-American dancer, whose name was Xavier Francis, while his left-leaning training was no longer congruent with the pro-business atmosphere of the Alemán administration, his politics matched Covarrubias's personal stance, as well as that of the majority of his colleagues at the academy. And Snow also notes that when Limón arranged for the Mexican cast of Tonantzintla to then perform in the United States at the American Dance Festival in Jacob's Pillow, Covarrubias was identified by the U.S. Department of State as harboring pro-communist leanings and could not secure a visa to accompany his own dancers to the United States. So this ambivalence was also reflected in the fact that the institute that Covarrubias himself headed changed its position several times on the tour in 1957. So at first it authorized the dancers to go to Moscow and then eventually to China, but then it changed its position and threatened that anyone who went on the tour would lose their jobs. But then when they came back, it was very successful. They actually celebrated the dancers and didn't fire them. And so it was not at all actually unusual to see this wide variety of dance styles, from Tonantzintla's Baroque, indigenous religious themed work, to Bravo's more explicitly revolutionary modern work on stage side by side. So in 1951, for example, when Tonantzintla premiered in Mexico City, Snow writes that, quote, the contrast among Covarrubias's brilliantly decorated evocations of Mexico's pre-conquest and vice-regal period pasts for Limon's choreography and Bravo's spare elegy to one of the leading figures of the recent revolution were pronounced. The contrasts were pronounced. And so this very contrast in style, approach, and content, which was present in the revolutionary Mexican modern dance from the beginning, is precisely what the 1957 tours brought to Chinese audiences, right? This wide range. And in his praiseful reviews of the Mexican dancers in the People's Daily, Jia Zuoguang summarized the experience of their performance as follows. He wrote, in sum, from the entire show, one can fully see how Mexican artists enthusiastically love life and laboring people and work hard to fulfill their artistic mission. Their works have a strong breath of life. So this phrase, breath of life, was actually used in a lot of the Chinese reviews, not only of the Mexican tours, but actually of many other dance tours from other countries. And so I can talk about that more in the Q&A if people are interested. But in this context, it referred to the fact that it actually had multiple meanings. So it referred to the fact that there was a sense of rural life being communicated in a lot of these performances through references to folklore, experiences of farmers, invocations of indigenous knowledge and aesthetics drawn from material culture and ritual, but also scathing political critiques of the painful realities of daily life for laboring people. So all of these found resonance in China's own dance culture, of course, at this time, and this offered a meeting point between China and Mexico through dance. So in the tours of the Mexican dancers, Sokolo's revolutionary spectatorship that Kostrin describes, I think, was extended to China. But it was done so through this vehicle of mestizo modernism. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
I'll sit here. Emily, you can come join me. Great. Thank you so much. Can people hear us? Yeah, so online people hear us, right? Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much, Emily, thank you for this wonderful presentation on your research. And over the years, your work really has laid the foundation, right, for dance to become a field of its own in China studies. And I'm really impressed and inspired by your scholarship, by your, building of the archive. I mean, all the archival materials that you have presented, of course, is also in the collection at University of Michigan, where you taught before. And so a shout out to our students who are interested in using this archive. And also, I know that you collaborate so much with the dance practitioners in China and also in overseas Chinese and Asian American communities. And so it's I think a really broad range of methods that you bring into your research. So I'm really inspired and happy to have you here. So I wanted to ask two questions, and then I know many of we have a lot of questions too. So one of the insights that you have shown us in this rich presentation is the capaciousness of international tour and the many productivities it held, right? We learned from your talk that the Cold War circuits of exchange was very surprising. It held many surprises for us. For example, on the Mexican side, who toured, with whom they toured, with two factions, right? Sort of were enemies before, but united. Where they toured, you talked about Amelia Hernandez, who was considered to be, very close to the socialist and Soviet dance. I think it was in your paper, not in the presentation, but you kind of closed with her. But she actually did not tour a socialist circuit. She actually toured the capitalist circuit, very surprisingly. And then you also talked about the Tonantzintla, right? The piece choreographed by the Mexican American modern dance choreographer Jose Limon, who was implicated in U.S. Cold War diplomacy. But then his piece toward China, also surprisingly, because you would imagine, his piece will be excluded, right, from this group. So besides these, sort of surprising examples of who toured where, what toured where, you also discuss these two competing or battling cliques, right, of dancers, the Ballet Nacional and then the Ballet Contemporáneo, and the possibility of the tour united them. Also, so that happened in the Mexican side. So in China, the tour also created fascinating encounters and crossroads. You mentioned in your paper, but not here, that international dancers who were present in China at the time met on tour. So there are different tours happening in China, and they met. For example, the New Siberia Ballet was at a performance in Shanghai with the Mexican ballet. And then the Mexican ballet was also at a performance of the Siberian ballet in Beijing. And then also there is a British film group who was also present, Ballet Rembert, I think, who was also in a Beijing performance. And so it was very choreographed and coordinated with all these dancers meeting in Shanghai, meeting in Beijing. And so this was also a fascinating, another fascinating aspect of these tours, right? These are never just solo tours. Also, the tours, as you said, created new terminology, such as 民间 ballet, 民族现代 ballet. There's also barefoot, right? 赤脚 ballet. And these terminologies were created through translation, which is also, according to the Professor Liu, very eventful happenings. And so they allow, these new terminologies are productive because they allowed room for Chinese audience to see Mexican modern dance as something new, right? Something from Mexican, experiences themselves. So I would really, and I'm very interested in hearing you to talk a bit more about tour as an object of study. how did you come to study tours? What do you find in the archive as you trace the itineraries? What kind of methods can be developed from studying these tours? You talked about dance as method. I mean, I think everything's a method. I don't want to push it on tour as method, but I'm curious just about the, why tours are so interesting. Also, you mentioned in the end, you end this talk with the breath of life. And so this is fascinating because, of course, breath has a lot to do with circulation, with space, with roominess, with freshness. And so what kind of new life and new air came into being through these circuits? So that's my first question. I'll go on to the second question, and I'll let you, answer more kind of sort of capaciously with because you might be touching on both questions. So the second question I want to ask is about the perceived correspondence between aesthetics and politics. First, in the Cold War politics of socialist versus capitalist, and then in the context of decolonization with issues of nationalism, internationalism, and hybridity, and the mestizo modernism. Because in the dance scene in Mexico, you wrote that, was very illuminating that the differences between these two battling factions had to do with aesthetics. Because Sokolow, right, had actually come from a revolutionary leftist tradition of modern dance in the U.S. But then, as you said, within the Mexican context, her followers became more aligned with U.S. trends, especially, the aesthetics of abstraction that became synonymous with anti-communism. Of course, in China also you have modern dance being censored or being dismissed as for that same association. But at the same time, you also show us that actually these dancers, either the modernist one or the more realist one, they were both actually left-leaning, and then that's why they were interested in traveling to Moscow, interested in traveling to China, and it's interesting. Also, you mentioned the case of Marina, who was in the modernist group. I shouldn't say modernist, modern dance group, right? Who accused what's her name? But Bravo as a communist kind of in the institute, and so Bravo was actually driven out. So it was very interesting to me that these kind of line fights became intensified when accusations are made, and perhaps because there are political resources, right, gaining political purchase or even economic resources that that the Cold War had set up in Mexico, that the stylistic differences became very so it's also interesting that Jia Zuoguang, whom you wrote about, and he used modern dance as a term to talk about Mexican dance, and then he connects it with with class struggle, but also with national color, and also the modern dance pieces in what you mentioned were also talked about by contemporary by Chinese commentators as having national color. So it's interesting that so we could probably see that Jia Zuoguang would be using these tours, right, the Mexican case, to redefine modern dance, which he had studied, and which he, also with I think he studied, that can be also a kind of a fresh breath, coming in, especially this was just right after the anti-rightist campaign. So I think there is a really interesting, redefinition and also broadening the repertoire for style while disconnecting style from politics, that kind of easy correspondence. I feel that it's having to do with here. And we also see nationalism, internationalism, and hybridity coming up as very key issues, right? I was mentioning that, modern dance then became, was sort of tolerated or celebrated even with for its national color. And we see that in cinema too, and in painting, when national color or 民族气派民族特色 then became used for a lot of innovations that were actually hybrid, right? And so and it seems to me that modern dance and ballet they have different and so modern dance and ballet, and I also want you to talk a bit more about that they have different political correspondences in the Cold War in terms of class politics and in terms of decolonization. And so how did this combination, modern dance, mestizo modern dance, plus barefoot ballet, right, coming to China at this time, redefining, because ballet and modern dance had all these connotations, and just really redefining them. And how does that influence Chinese dance, especially revolutionary ballet later on? So you can answer as you wish.
Oh, that was such a wonderful discussion, and you really did such an amazing job of pulling out a lot of the the sort of consequences of what we're looking at.
Rich paper.
Thank you. So first, the issue of dance tours. So so the topic of dance tours is a very rich one within dance studies, and so I'm definitely taking inspiration from people like Naoma Previtz, who wrote a very important book called Dance for Export about the role of dance in the U.S. State Department's Cold War diplomacy. And then Claire Croft, who also wrote about, it's called Dancers as Diplomats, kind of retelling that story through deeper investigation of the archives. So both of those books really give us a really clear understanding of how people like Jose Limon, he was actually the first company that was funded by the State Department project, right, in what became these tours, right? So a lot of American dancers like Martha Graham, the American ballet, like the ballet companies and the modern dance companies from the United States were toured internationally in the context of Cold War diplomacy. So that relationship between American ballet on the one hand and also American modern dance, like it coalesced in that context of the Cold War tours. And so there's been a lot of scholarship on that. And there's also been some scholarship on the Soviet tours, right, where the Soviet ballet companies would come to the United States. And so there was this sort of like competition in the ballet world between the US and the Soviet Union. And then modern dance really became associated with the United States. And recently there's been more scholarship looking at sort of how those tours extended into Asia. But a lot of the scholarship up until now has looked sort of at like US sphere kind of. So like American, like Alvin Ailey, for example, going to Taiwan, right? There was a PhD student at OSU who now works in Taiwan who's been doing really amazing research about Yoda Lee, about, sort of how countries in Asia or, contexts in Asia were then sort of also receiving these tours, right? And so I was also inspired by this sort of new generation of scholarship looking at the extension of these tours into Asia. But I haven't really seen scholarship looking at the socialist side of this, right, in Asia. And so I wanted to contribute to this larger conversation about the Cold War dance tours that is already very vibrant by bringing in another context, which is China. So if we look at China as sort of the site and look at what dancers were coming into China, I think it gives us a different picture of who were the big names at that time. So for example, it brings forward people like Bravo from Mexico, who's not really a well-known name in dance history. But the fact that she was touring internationally, I think it sort of gives us a different set of, famous people, right, that we can then bring back into our understanding of global 20th century dance history from more of a global South and leftist kind of perspective on that history. And then aside from that, there's been really interesting developments in the use of digital humanities. So like, for example, there's a project led by Harmony Bench at Ohio State University and Kate Elswit called Dunham's Data, where they're really trying to use the affordances of digital humanities to give us new ways of actually mapping tours. So they take the one case study of Katherine Dunham, who was one of the most famous African-American dancers in the mid-20th century, and they actually try to trace like all of her touring routes all over the world and sort of analyze it from different perspectives. So I think this whole, like you said, tour as method, like it's a very vibrant one within dance studies. And so I want my book to speak to that, but bringing in like this empirical material that hasn't been considered before. And then thinking about, like you said, like what actually happens on the tours, right? So like, as you said, it's not only the international companies coming to China, but like they're often meeting each other in China while they're there. And another really interesting thing that happened that was like very explicitly planned in the Chinese context was that apparently Zhou Enlai had this idea to like appoint Chinese dancers to like shadow the tours and then like actually learn the dances while they were touring China. So the Dongfang Gouhuan performance ensemble, some of their early works were actually developed through that process, where like there was a tour from Burma at the time, right, Myanmar, and then they would assign some dancers to like go along with that company, and at the end of the tour they would perform on stage with them, and they would perform a Burmese dance, right? They also did that with the Indian delegation. I wrote about that in my Performing Bandung article. So I think like that's also something I'm interested in, is like what was made possible actually during the tour process, right? As a different type of interaction. And so that's the first question. And then the second question, the aesthetics and politics. So this is actually something I've been thinking about, ever, even before. So in the process of working on revolutionary bodies, I published this article in Positions, the Post-Colonial Blind Spot. And so one of the things I was really thinking about when writing that article was how what was going on in China, this effort to create a national dance form that was revolutionary, but was also based on folkloric material, based on classical Chinese dance, had a lot more in common with what was happening in places like Mexico, what was happening in many post-colonial countries around the world. And so I sort of, in the back of my mind, always wanted to do a comparative project looking at how what happened in China had a lot more in common with what was happening in other global South countries. And I think this project is giving me a way to like think through that by actually looking at the actual meeting points, right? So it's not just a comparative project, but it's actually, okay, these are the companies that were coming. So they saw some kind of actual historical connection, and then thinking about how what they were doing was similar. So in the case that I gave today with the Mexican mestizo modernism, like we can clearly see how they were grappling with some of the same questions about how to make ballet, in this case, modern dance, but in other cases it was ballet, how to like localize it and create it into an anti-colonial kind of aesthetic that would highlight local color, as you said, right, as a political act. And so it's interesting because this in 1957, the other case study I'm working on right now is the Uday Shankar company, who is very similar in the sense that he was doing Indian modern dance. And so, so I'm planning on putting these two case studies in the same chapter with a couple other case studies. There's also a group from Colombia that does a lot of Afro-diasporic Colombian work. So I'm thinking about them together as like a global South modernism kind of like chapter, right? And then there's going to be a chapter on global South ballet, right? So like what you said, it's happening in each of the genre spaces, but at the same time, I don't want to reify the genres because I think like modern dance doesn't capture what's going on. And I think even ballet doesn't fully capture because it's national ballet or folk ballet or however you want to describe it. And so, so like the Cuban National Ballet is one of the companies that I'll be talking about in the ballet chapter. But yeah, so I absolutely think that this aesthetic, the merging of aesthetics and politics is definitely what they were grappling with. And I think it's definitely what this like 生活气息, like this breath of life phrase is sort of also getting at. It's like, they're trying to articulate a kind of artistic practice that is rooted in the people, right? It's like 群众化, right? But it's also 民族化, it's 革命化. So I think it's like a way to describe that aesthetic that's more everyday rather than like ideological. But I do want to sort of think about that as like a theorization of the aesthetic practice that they're aiming towards. So, yeah, thank you.
That's great, thank you. So let's maybe.
Yeah.